Okay, this lesson for the Quantity Project class, I'll be quite brief, but often we discuss dead in sins and we hear adamant affirmations asserting that the dead in sins means unable to believe. And then we've evaluated and asked, well, what about persuasion, which precedes and what results in faith, and even demonstrated that paismone, persuasion, Galatians 5:8, and pistis, faith, are essentially equivalent. Also, we demonstrated that patho, write that up here, patho, persuade. You can look that up in your Blue Letter Bible. Results in pistis, faith. We remember that this faith comes to the one without faith, pistos, one without faith, unfaithful one if it's referring to a believer, and also one without faith. And so that takes care of that. And we noticed, what was it, John 3:36, there were those apathon, that is rather the one negating persuasion. So if the person out here is then quickened, made alive together with, if you ever look at that word quickened, it's from the preposition seen, that's together with. And then zoe, life, and then poieo, making. I should have put the verb there, but it's okay. So the point is that sometimes our constructs contradict. So we adamantly affirm that dead in sins here refers to the inability to believe. Well, you go back to the first chapter, it says they'd already believed after you believed the gospel of your salvation. I mean, after you heard the gospel of your salvation, after you believed. And so that wasn't really the discussion. This is written to a church, a congregation of people who've already believed. And the contradiction comes is when you say dead in sins is, and of course, if you go to Ephesians 2:12, it says that we were outside of Christ, choris. And I'll show you here that John 1:3, outside of him, not even one thing which has come to be, comes to be. Sorry, I forgot to write this one, comes to be. There. So nothing came to be, not even one thing which has come to be, comes to be outside of him. And so here's the key word here, that now on one hand, we might be adamantly affirming that a person is dead outside of Christ and unable to believe, and then suggest that a person has life. This is the regeneration. Precedes faith. Not sure what that's about. It doesn't, even the late R.C. Sproul said, but not temporally. So I have no idea why he would assert it and then negate it in the same statement, but he did, and he was certainly someone who had even admitted that until he was in a class and a particular professor wrote it on a board, he had never thought of it or even heard of it, certainly never read it in the New Testament. And I'm referring to that which will be explicitly stated. So we have one, dead in sins. We have that meaning, that's what it means to be outside of Christ. We remember that outside of him, nothing comes to be or has come to be, nor shall it come to be, that has come to be. So we know this places the highest valuation on Jesus. How do we enter Jesus? Paul said we're regenerated or fathered, begotten, King James, fathered, genao. This is genesa, aorist. You can see that very simply with that augment and the ending. That's simply an aorist. So it's simple action, aorist. And he said, fathered through the gospel. So there's even those who affirm regeneration is apart from the gospel, and that the gospel has some function later for conversion, but not for regeneration. And yet we have a text. And this is what happens. Our constructs, we can only be looking. And this is the advantage of biases if you are willing to step away from them and observe, because often people, we all want to go seek, it's called confirmation bias. We'll go find the text that supports our assertion that a person dead in sins, a person outside of Christ, Ephesians 2:12, that person outside of Christ somehow then on one hand, let's say if you're a high Calvinist, whatever that is, you're adamantly affirming on the one hand that outside of Christ we're dead in sins and unable to believe. And the next minute you're saying somehow outside of Christ we came to be alive. That's a contradiction, but not in the text. Galatians 2:16, Paul said eidotes, that's that perfect active participle. He said, as ones who have previously noticed, insight noticed, and it's also awareness. And you may have heard of the famous clinical psychologist who makes speeches, and he talks about self-awareness or self-consciousness. That's this word here. We are aware, and he says, as ones who have noticed, become aware and are always aware. And he mentioned the gospel, that not even one kind, not that no kind of man is being justified out from any kind of works of any kind of law except through faith of Jesus Christ, demonstrably faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So he said, even we ourselves believed, simple form of action, believed into Christ Jesus in order that we might be justified out from the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. John 3:16 says, everyone who is believing into him might not perish. So the contradiction is that on the one hand, we're asked to believe that dead in sins, being outside of Christ, means things that would, if we're unable to believe and we're unable to be persuaded, then what is it apart from the gospel? So it's best to get your soteriology, let's just application here. Our soteriology shouldn't be nullified by the contradiction within our own construct. That is, let's say I'm a Calvinist and was often accused of one, especially when I came out and joined that ecclesia in Jacksonville, the New Covenant community. And if I preached salvation by grace, I was accused. Well, then finally, a snarky Calvinist emerged in our congregation. I heard testimonies of the same types of thing in the lecture series at the seminary, speaking of Calvinism, and pastors gave their testimonies of some of the hardships they experienced. But now I call them chiefly snarky. Their attitudes reflected a superficial level of knowledge. They could barely remember TULIP. You might have to remind the one that I dealt with. And he could barely recall things he was hoping to use to abuse people. Literally, he had no influence, but he would try to intimidate. And it was interesting because he didn't know what to do when he noticed how biblically literate and how much Bible knowledge our congregation had. So here, without Christ, outside of Jesus, there is no life. That's established fact. And no one would give that truth up just to support a contradiction within a construct. So when you hear people say you're unable to believe because you're dead in sins and trespasses, well, the definition there was being outside of Christ. And you won't be made alive together with Christ outside of him, apart from him. So that's another contradiction. When you notice this word together with, very strong word like a woven basket. And then it says, in him we have redemption of sin. So these people already believed in. They'd already been fathered through the gospel. They'd already been made aware that, and this is Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and he used the same gospel that, and this is a causal participle. So if we were really wanting to be true, that is, if Calvinism were scripted by koine, we would have expected in Galatians 2:16, genao. And I've written that out before in the actual perfect active indicative. So, but he didn't say, having been generated or fathered, now we believed. That's That's not possible. So it's nothing to be critical about. Like I said, I'd rather us learn the Bible. And if you just simply have energy to banter with a Calvinist or you literally have energy to fight, that's fine. It's the kind of fuel that won't burn long. You won't, and as I always say, it's the kind of fuel that won't learn long. That is, your learning will just be enough to argue with your um, adversary, whatever that is. But this is so we can learn how to defend the faith, give a rationale. And in this case, the points I made here is that dead in sins, by definition, in the same chapter, Ephesians 2:5, dead in sins, Ephesians 2:12, outside of Christ. That's what that is. John 1:3, don't forget that nothing outside of Christ comes to be. And then you can notice genomai and the relationship of that and genao. Remember, persuade results in faith. Faith comes to the one without faith. There are those who negate persuasion. So all the gospel and all that, according to this assertion, that we would come alive somehow without it and somehow outside of Christ. So there's two things that we know. There's no such thing as being fathered except through the gospel, and there's no such thing as being quickened outside of Christ. So this is very clear, and here's our 3 points. 1, 2, 3, and over here 1, 2, 3. So we're done. There's really no argument. It's just there's no such thing, and we can be distracted from the one who called us. It's the grace of Christ, and it's His Father who called us out from or away from an unmerited favor in Christ Jesus. So the Jesus lifted up will draw, the Father draws. He drew through the prophets who came and preached. Matter of fact, even Agrippa said in such a short synopsis, Paul, you're already leading me or causing me to want or persuading me to come to be a Christian. So it's very efficacious, the gospel, even a short synopsis of it. And very interesting that believing into John 3:16, Jesus said it, Paul said, believe into Jesus Christ. So we have it. That's it. It's just, you may not often notice that someone you may be trying to defend or argue for dead in sins means inability to believe, such as what people say. So dead in sins is what I guess you'd have to say would be the definition of total depravity for a Calvinist construct. But in the Bible, dead in sins mean outside of Christ, dead being the key word, sins being the means like poison. The sins are what brought the death. Christ is alone what brings the life. But notice, charis, outside of, there's no such thing outside of Christ as life. So it's true, outside of Christ, one is dead, but it's the persuade. We persuade men, Paul said. So that's enough. It's a short synopsis. It's just, I don't know very many people that hear what they're saying. You can't on one hand say dead, unable to believe, and then later say, no, they have life first, then they believe, then they trust into Jesus Christ. Well, there's no life outside. Now, that's all the text affords me to say. And encouraged by it because I can take what's explicitly stated, show the value of the gospel, we're Father through it, show that nothing, not even one thing, comes to be, which comes to be, it will never come to be outside of Christ. And that's including us. There's no such thing as a lost person becoming, or a person dead in sins being outside of Christ, coming to life outside of Christ. There's no such thing. So have a blessed day. Enjoy this. And if you notice contradictions like this, let's first notice them in ourselves, and then let's first remember and ask ourselves, what's our motive? Do we want to posit outwardly or just pick a side? Well, this reflects the desire to posit outwardly and to highly value and magnify Christ. So we couldn't more magnify Christ than remind ourselves or be reminded that nothing happens outside of Him. Outside of Him is the definition of dead in sins. We're persuaded. We are fathered through the gospel. We're persuaded, and faith and persuasion are essentially equivalent. Paul said here, he quoted the gospel, said, believed into Jesus, John 3:16, believe into Jesus. So have a blessed day.